Well, hello everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the latest Imperial webinar series on translation management. My name is Tony Cullen. A couple housekeeping items. First off, if you have questions, please send them to the Imperial webinar. That will be me, and I can go ahead and take those. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So we will go ahead and be sure to address those there as well. And we will be sending out the file, the slides to everybody upon the completion of the webinar. We have a great turnout. Thanks again, and without further ado, Erica, if you'd like to go ahead and get started.
Sure, no problem. Thanks so much, Tony. You actually can keep right on that slide in the very beginning. This presentation is mostly going to be focused on the typical reasons that translation projects go awry within the clinical space, especially with regards to patient recruitment materials, and the main reasons that money, time, energy, and sanity get eaten up, and ways to avoid that, both at a couple of different levels, the project planning phase, and then also with overall translation services in a process implementation phase. Just a little bit about me so that you know what kinds of questions I'm even capable of answering. I actually started out in the legal field and not in translation and interpretation. I developed some working tools for not-for-profits with regards to helping them have resources to comply with Americans with Disabilities Act so that they could ensure equal access to not only their facilities but their programs. And with that experience, apparently a translation and interpretation agency owner thought that that was valuable in helping them to develop training materials for healthcare providers so that they could better understand their obligations for language accommodation, developing a plan, how interpretation services, both spoken language and sign language, contributed to an equal access program within their healthcare institutions. So that brought me some visibility to the translation space, and I actually had implemented scheduling software for a translation department before being recruited to be a project manager. My first job as a project manager in translation, in the translation space, was actually just a whole lot of patient recruitment and retention materials. I pretty much lived that for a number of years, and so my familiarity with the particular issues surrounding patient recruitment and retention materials and where translation projects typically go awry in that area is a lot where this presentation is going to be geared towards. But I've also managed both interpretation and translation departments as well in the past. And so we're all on the same page with regards to translation as an academic pursuit, as an industry, as a task, as a project. The fun thing about language is that we are actually attempting to do a great feat when you have images, ideas, concepts, very abstract things that are conjured in your mind, and you're trying to convey them to another person through all of their filters, their perceptions, their upbringing, their values, their context, and you're doing that through a very imperfect medium of just words and language. It's quite a feat to be able to do that just in and of itself, and quite another to be able to mirror that same impact from one language and convert that so that its impact is mirrored in another language. And the process of translating or converting those words or written text from one language to another is what we call translation. And so just to illustrate one example, if I were to say yellow lab, an image is conjured. So a group of us are actually sitting and we have a very distinct image of a particular breed of dog in our minds. However, the divergence starts to come in. Is that dog running in your mind? Is it swimming? Is it shaking the water off? All of these different images are where it diverges and where language becomes very imperfect. So am I really conveying my message? Am I having the same impact? And so trying to do that all in the context of another language, am I able to replicate that impact, that message, that concept? Am I able to conjure those same images in another language is actually quite a feat. So thinking of just language, not even translation, and how we use it, how we convey images, thoughts, concepts to one another, just in terms of industries. So legalese, the literary world, the business world, the financial world, all of these different industries have a lot of people trying to communicate with one another. And let's be honest, some of us are a little lazy, and so we start creating different terms and phrases as quick references so that we can instantly convey different types of concepts to one another. For example, if I were just to bust out with CDC and I'm going to go there to have lunch, are you immediately going to think of the Centers for Disease Control, or are you going to think of the Corporate Development Center? Depends on what industry we're in, depends on what the common language that I'm speaking with you is. And so all of those different things help a language actually evolve through people using it. So it's ever-changing, it's ever-evolving, and there's lots of industry niche lingo and terminology, phrases, expressions, initialisms, acronyms. So you name it, it really requires a lot of exposure and experience to any particular industry just to know what people are talking about in one language, and being able to understand it to the level that you understand the impact and then convert that to a target language is a whole other feat unto itself. So translation tends to evolve in the same way that language does, and the industry segregates in a lot of the same ways that language itself segregates. So you have a lot of different fields where the translators themselves have gained exposure and experience to the language being used in each of these fields. And so life science translation is one segment among many within the translation industry. And that's definitely because of the need for familiarity with the terminology, the experience, and then also they really need to be able to anticipate the end user's goals within that industry so that they can understand the message, the context in which it comes, and how to really mirror that impact in that target language. So now that we've got a base and we're all hopefully on the same page with regards to translation itself, why on earth do translation projects, not that it wasn't already difficult to begin with, but the projects themselves end up just feeling a lot like a big, crazy maze of fire all the time? And there's a lot of different reasons for that. One is just the sheer volume of complexity. You have, even if your translation project only starts out with a few files, so for example, you have a recruitment retention kit, you've developed some materials for your patients, you divide that up into some recruitment materials, some patient tools, some retention materials that'll hopefully move on later on during the study or the program. And even if you just started out with 5 little files in the very beginning, we're just going to apply a very standard, broad variation of a translation process, translation, editing, proofreading, nothing fancy. And so 5 little files going into, moderate study, 20 countries, or maybe 15 countries into 20 languages, mostly because I can't do math very quickly in my head. You take 5 files into 20 languages, all of a sudden, one translation step, you have 100 files. Translation goes to editing, now 100 files has become 200 files. That goes to proofreading, you now have 300 files. A couple days into a translation project, your little baby 5-file project has now become 300 files that need to be categorized, version controlled, and managed. And that's just if everything went smoothly and quietly and nobody complained and there were no arguments about linguistic differences between the translator and the proofreader. You also have the issue of having multiple project timelines and phases, so your recruitment materials will go at a different phase than your retention materials that go in a different phase than your patient tools. That multiplies the amount of management needed, along with you went to 20 languages in 15 countries. What if Turkey doesn't like your materials? What if Hungary says, bad translation, I don't like it, I want to write all of my materials myself? Now you have all of these different versions that are running around in the world, and that's before we've even gotten to our very first protocol amendment, my favorite scope change. And with all of this chaos and compounding that with, I needed it yesterday, what on earth is the local team saying, why are they saying it, what are their needs, if they wanted to rewrite the materials and add all these edits, what exactly are they editing, why, how is it deviating from the source material, and basically chaos just ensues. A lot of these are just absolute realities to our everyday existence in patient recruitment, retention materials, content development, and going into translation. But a lot of these things can actually be avoided, but it does require some know-how and a desire to want to invest in your projects ahead of time. The fun thing is that all translation projects suffer from a lot of the same things, and a lot of those usual suspects are compounded by special needs and clinical trials. But any translation project of any brand or fashion, there's tons of things that can be done ahead of time to try to neutralize a lot of this chaos. And the very first and foremost is just using the professional translators. Now that we kind of have a base understanding of what is actually required, it's not just academic proficiency in more than one language. The art of converting and replicating and mirroring that impact of the message from one language to another is an academic pursuit all on its own, and it's an additional skill set that really requires exposure, experience, and a lot of specialized training. But most people have that under control, but the reality is that content development, people rarely think of content development in terms of translation while they're developing their source content. And it's because they're not thinking globally from the very beginning. In the English materials, it could be very fancy to have a pun, an idiom, to be in a very clever way conjuring imagery and conveying these concepts. And the reality is, it may not actually even be translatable into another language. Not necessarily that you have to make everything straightforward, bland, possibly boring, in order to be able to translate into multiple languages, but you definitely need to be having some forethought involved so that you can have a plan in place to be able to manage when a phrase or a pun or an idiom isn't going to be translatable. What are you going to do? What are the instructions going to be to the translation team? And then a lot of people really underestimate the use of pictures. It's kind of standard to be able to put them into things like instructions for use cards, where images and instructions, how to put the cap on the syringe, those types of materials, people kind of have a good grasp on, yep, I'm going to use pictures, it's a lot easier, faster, more effective, more clear, I don't have to worry as much about literacy, comprehension, a lot of other things that go into writing materials. But also, even with the exercise that we did with the Yellow Lab, it really shows that in order to get people on the same page of understanding concepts and seeing the same imagery when they're trying to understand or comprehend within their mind what you're trying to message to them, pictures are a very instantaneous, effective way to communicate. And when a lot of people in content development are concentrating, they get preoccupied with how is this going to sound, what are the actual words, I'm going to flip this word over here and I'm going to move it over here. And the literary aspect becomes very, very much the focus, and a lot of people forget to step back and realize that using a picture could absolutely convey your message faster, more effectively, and then you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about translation at all. It would decrease your word count. It could be done in a faster way if you can absolutely shorten the amount of text that needs to be dealt with, things of that nature. And then, honestly, the biggest and probably best bang for one's buck is to have a good project plan in place and really understand where are you trying to go. A lot of first-time translation purchasers struggle because they're not really sure what the end product is supposed to be, or they're not very effective at articulating it. And so a lot of people feel that once they have a finalized product in a source language, that they want it to look like the exact same thing in Japanese or in Spanish or in Turkish. And the reality is, if that's not really what the end goal, if the end goal and the end purpose is just to clone the source material and have it look exactly like it just happens to be in Turkish, that's great. A standard translation would be fine. There probably won't be so many scope changes. Nobody will think of things as an afterthought like, will this even work for a Turkish audience? Is this impact, or is this content, or is this message effective? Will it actually be mirrored in the target language, but is it also in compliance with local regulations? A lot of these aspects to end goal development and understanding can lead to a lot of cost savings and a lot of time savings and definitely a lot of sanity saving if you thought of a planned approach in terms of, I want to go from point A to G, I take a nice straight one-path way to get there, as opposed to, I'm going to go to A to B, oh, but hold on, because I need to go to C, and then, oh, right turn to D, E, and then maybe an F that's kind of backtracked along my A to B line. And a lot of people don't understand that in translation projects, those are really easy to come by if you don't have your end goal very specifically in mind. And then just to touch on file and translation memory management, what are your end goals? Translation memory is kind of thrown around as a nifty term. Oh, I can recycle your previously translated content. It's going to be so easy. You'll save money. I can just reuse it over and over again. But the reality is, do you really want to be doing that? Is that your really end goal? Is it to manage your consistency along with having some cost savings? Who are you going to have within your organization to be able to really invest in keeping it up to date? Who's going to be doing the approvals of the content? Do you even want the content a literal translation from English to your target languages? Do you want your local teams to have the flexibility to be able to adapt the information for their local needs, for their local regulations? In which case, translation memory management becomes a different beast, and it's not just a simple matter of recording all of the data and then regurgitating it out with your next translation project. And that's just all regular translation projects in general. If we move on to things that compound in terms of basically potential for things to go badly in clinical trials, you now are adding in compressed timelines, inconsistent feedback between local teams. There's no real standard because the local needs vary from country to country depending on regulation, culture, how best to be successful in every different region and country takes on a different path. Are you ready to manage all of those different needs? A lot of clinical trials I've experienced projects going through, the information isn't even really there. My favorite, I think, in my experience was, great, source materials approved, translation go. Great. What countries were you planning on having in your study so that I know which languages to translate into? Slightly critical, but a lot of people just don't take the time to take a breath and realize what information they really need and at which point. So are you 90% sure that these are the countries that are going to participate in your study? Is it worth investing in getting those translated ahead of time so that you're not behind the 8 ball later? Or are the countries that claim that they're participating in your study at this point, it's really a 50-50 chance if any of them will participate, and so are you spending money without any reassurance that it's going to be worth anything to you later? And then, of course, the different levels of edits during scope changes and being able to manage and have a plan for how are you going to manage your sponsor edits versus your local EC edits versus site-specific edits, and at which point is your translation project manager going to get the visibility to be able to understand which documents this impacts. This is a regional regulation. It affects all EU countries. Therefore, when I make this change to my English source, it's actually my ROW, but now my English ROW source is now my English just EU source files, and so now this must be implemented in EU countries only. Ex-EU countries and the US don't apply. Is there a plan to be able to manage all of that information give visibility to the people who are involved who require it? Is the timing the most effective time, or are we reacting to information that's premature and incurring costs by doing that reaction ahead of too soon? Things of that nature. So all of these combined, you can really save a lot of time and money and anxiety by really thinking of these things ahead of time and putting in a plan and a process. There's absolutely things that can be done on many different levels. So you think in terms of implementing an organization-wide process versus things that can be done on just a project level. So an individual project manager who may not necessarily have control of content development, but once that content is developed, how can that end goal be better articulated to a translation vendor or translation project manager so that the project can be planned accordingly? Another thing that I found really successful in just being able to distinguish from study team to study team is managing roles and responsibilities. This seems to cut down on a lot of back and forth, a lot of redundancy in effort of reviewing the materials over and over and over again. It's really just seeing where the value lies in terms of a project. So what are the people involved in the project really adding at each stage? So when you have a translation project and you have the translations are completed, they're with local contacts for review. What are the credentials of those local contacts? What are they really going to be able to add without just re-reviewing and making preferential changes? I don't like the way this sounds. It's not incorrect. I personally don't like it. Does that add value, or does that just incur a whole lot of costs of an additional round of back and forth, a confirmation that they didn't introduce errors of their own? Did they deviate from the source text material, so now we have to get special approval from legal, from the sponsor, in order to implement this change? And so really just looking at your team and what their levels of expertise are and in which areas, and being able to kind of corral what they're allowed to change by giving them some coherent, concise instructions. So with regards to, and I've just thrown an example, this is one example of many that I've been involved with navigating with different study teams and different project managers. Just delegating the in-country linguists, the actual translators, and having them do their translation, but then managing the local contact review. They do have value to add, but it's not necessarily in the way that people throw the files at them and expect them to review. If they're given the instructions of really corralling their edits so that they're meaningful, so they have better knowledge and visibility to the protocol, the study design. They have better access and visibility to the information regarding the study site needs of the staff and the patients. What are patients concerned about? What patients in your particular region would respond better to? And definitely when you're talking about IRB or EC submissions, what have previous ECs allowed and what have they rejected? And based on what criteria, what regulations? Those are the types of things that are absolutely valuable for your local contacts to be reviewing in a translated file. But just flipping the language, just changing preferentially the style, the tone, and then quite honestly, a lot of local contacts, given no direction and just given files and told to review them, don't review them in the correct format, making it difficult for linguists to review their work in terms of marked changes or track changes. So even just giving those instructions to local contacts and not doing anything else really reduces the amount of churn and the amount of turnaround time that a lot of translation projects experience when these aren't in place. And if you were feeling particularly ambitious, the best way to go about it is to really have an integrated process for content development, translation, submission, when you go to production, and even distribution. Having a lot of different expertise upstream the amount of value that they can add to any given step from the very beginning at a most cost-effective point in time is extremely helpful. So in terms of content development, a lot of people, they might think in terms of going global immediately, and so they may think that, oh, a translation project manager's expertise and exposure to typical problems in the dynamic of language would be able to help me with my content to make it more culturally neutral. They might be able to tell me what types of graphics are deemed acceptable. They might be able to vet different logos or caricatures or graphics if they're acceptable in different regions. But some people don't really think of content or materials development in terms of production. So do you have production experts also involved in developing the specifications that your materials are going to eventually be produced in? Are you really enlisting your distribution experts on packaging and cost-effective ways of transport into specifications? Are you having your distribution and production in contact with each other, having visibility to the project at the development stage? A lot of these things can be avoided if you just think of where that the most time-effective and cost-effective point at which each expert can be enlisted into a project saves so much time and money over the long haul, and eliminates a lot of extra churn and a huge amount of redundancy. I think in translation especially, I've seen so much content development go on without any visibility given to the translation project manager. By the time translation is in process, now they've discovered that the production specs were not correct or couldn't work for their end goal of their project. And so now the translated files all need to be updated. So the 5 files that had the wrong specs that are now 300 files that need updated specs, the amount of cost and work involved in being able to update them at that time, as opposed to having the original developed products contain the correct and useful specs, is just how the cost and timeline really get compoundedly impacted over time. And with that, I'm totally open to taking questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Erica. A lot of good information there. We do have a few questions that have come in. Kate wants to know, she says, you talked about applying information at the most valuable time, and was wondering if you could maybe provide an example of what you feel or what you've seen in your experience.
Sure. Sometimes I like to loosely apply the just-in-time manufacturing principle to it in terms of having information at the right time. So a lot of studies I've seen suffer have been because of information that was applied or acted upon in a really premature way. And so the project managers are well-intentioned. They want to get this done. They want to get the materials out the door to sites as soon as humanly possible. But they're reacting on information that they're not necessarily given visibility to, that it's not quite finalized, or here are the countries, but nobody's really given the project manager any visibility to, these are the countries we're thinking of, as opposed to, no, these are the countries that have sites that we've negotiated contracts with that are already up and ready to receive materials or recruit patients or what have you. And so those are really important aspects to a project plan that without any visibility, the project manager really doesn't have the information or the tools to be able to make any proper judgment calls with regards to, okay, we're going to be able to implement translation for these materials at risk, knowing that, yes, there are sites, no, there are no patients yet, versus, yes, there are countries that are loosely being considered as candidates and there are no running sites. It's a really different type of information, and so it's really an evaluation of what kind of information is very useful and what kind of visibility to how accurate that information is at that time that can really impact a project manager's ability to manage the project well.
Okay. Next question is from Joy, and I think there are probably a few others out there in the audience like her. She's a project manager, and of course, scope changes are very much out of the control of the project manager. Is there anything outside of what you've mentioned in the presentation that could possibly help?
Absolutely. There may not necessarily be the huge cost and timeline savings that I've touched on in the presentation, but if you can anticipate, so if you've at least worked with the study team before, this study team always claims things are final, they never are, I'm given visibility that there's going to be a protocol amendment, or my last 7 studies have all had protocol amendments, 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can definitely have a project plan that already anticipates having those scope changes. And if you can manage and implement a project that anticipates those scope changes, you can absolutely find the most cost-effective, time-effective place in order to implement them. So having a plan, for example, protocol amendment. I'm going through translation in 7 countries and 10 languages, but I know that there's going to be a protocol amendment. The study team's at least given me visibility to the fact that they're thinking of adding another arm to the study, or they're thinking of just adding a couple visits, or they're thinking of just adding a few tests to a few existing visits. Having that information ahead of time, or sometimes even if you don't, but you anticipate just a protocol amendment that may or may not impact existing materials, you can at least start to plan even in your original content development. If I'm creating a study guide and I at least have visibility to the fact that there's going to be a few additional visits, I can make sure that the designer is aware of that and anticipate that there's going to be extra room needed. Or in my translated versions, I'm going to have to anticipate that I'm going to need to add a couple of study visits. And so I need to make sure that there's enough white space or enough clear space, or that the graphics can be manipulated in such a way that I can add those without having to relay out or to redesign or to reconstruct the entire specification of the document. And so there's definitely ways to anticipate, and if you have a plan ahead of time, you can absolutely, at the very least, save a lot of your own sanity.
Okay. We have another question here. Tim's asking, do you feel that most of these principles that you've talked about today would apply to other materials used in clinical trials, or all materials used?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the slides was just about translation projects in general, and so of course all of those principles apply. But a lot of the ones, even of the example that I had of the sample process and this is just one of many samples I developed with different clients along the way, but even a typical process that could look like this could benefit different types of materials, not just recruitment and retention materials, if you still have a content development. So maybe it's not a marketing material or a patient tool. Even if it's informed consent form, you still have a level of development and levels of approval. So instead of a marketing context or emphasis, knowing that you have to go through legal departments, knowing that you have to have regulatory or legal approvals in different countries, regions, different organizations, different local contacts, knowing all of that ahead of time absolutely can help one develop a coherent process for any given material as well.
Okay. And Mark would like to know, what does it mean to provide a certification of translation at the end? Is this a legal document or just something that anybody can whip together?
Translation certificates, it is a legal document. It's usually a notarized expression that your translation vendor has assured you that any particular translation process has been applied, and that's really all that it promises, is that the process was adhered to and completed by adequate level professionals.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see that's all the questions that we have out there now. We should see Erica's contact information up there shortly. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact her. Again, this is Tony Cullen for the Imperial Webinar Series. I want to thank everybody for attending. We will have copies of the webinar that will be made available afterwards. Thank you very much, everybody.